They said I was in the way. Too old, too slow, nothing but a shadow taking up space. Their voices cut through me like sharp blades, each word another reminder that in their eyes, my worth had expired. They thought I would cry, beg, maybe even collapse in shame. Instead, I lowered my gaze, clutched the worn leather bag I always carried, and walked away in silence. What they didn't know was that inside that bag, folded neatly in an envelope, was the deed to their company. The very foundation of their pride, their wealth, their identity. It was already mine. And the moment they pushed me out, they unknowingly placed their future into my hands. I was 72 years old that day. My hair carried the silver of 1,000 battles fought, and my skin bore the stories of sacrifices they would never understand. For decades, I had worked, supported, and built the life they so easily took for granted. I had lived simply, never demanding more than respect and honesty in return. But those things, the very things that should have been given freely, were denied to me. I had always been the quiet one in the room, the one who listened more than she spoke, the one who handled the small tasks no one else wanted. And perhaps that was my greatest mistake, teaching them that my silence was weakness, when in reality, it was strength. They mistook my calm presence for insignificance, and my patience for passivity. They believed they were shoving aside a powerless old woman, not realizing they were dismissing the rightful owner of everything they held dear. I remember looking at their faces as they turned away from me, not 1 ounce of hesitation, not a flicker of guilt. Their eyes burned with the arrogance of youth and the blindness of entitlement. They had forgotten the very roots that allowed them to stand tall, and in their ignorance, they severed themselves from me completely. Walking down those cold steps after they expelled me, I held my head high. The world around me seemed quieter than usual, as if it were waiting, holding its breath for what would come next. The sun shone harshly against my skin, reminding me of the years I had endured storms much greater than this. And yet, in that silence, a new truth settled deep inside me. Being underestimated was no longer a curse, it was my greatest weapon. Because what they failed to understand is that the same woman they mocked, the one they labeled as in the way, was the woman who had earned the trust of the man who built their empire. And that man, in his final moments, left me the one thing he knew: they could never handle the responsibility of ownership. So when I walked away that day, I did not walk away broken. I walked away carrying their destiny, a secret burning like fire inside my chest. They thought they had humiliated me. They thought they had erased me. But soon, they would discover that the woman they dismissed as useless was the very heartbeat of everything they thought belonged to them. And that is where this story begins, not with their cruelty, but with the quiet power of a woman they tried to destroy. Sacrifice has a sound. It is not the sound of applause, nor the rush of gratitude. It is the silence of long nights spent awake while others sleep. The creak of tired bones bending over tasks no one else cares to notice. The steady hum of life continuing because someone unseen is holding it together. That was the rhythm of my life for decades. While others lived boldly in the light, I lived quietly in the shadows, giving more than I ever had, receiving less than I ever deserved. And though I never complained, each act of sacrifice carved deeper lines into my face, deeper strength into my soul. From the time I was young, I believed that my worth would be measured in what I gave. I worked tirelessly long shifts that left my hands raw, double jobs that kept me from my own dreams, days when hunger gnawed at my stomach but my children and family were fed. I knew the cost of survival, and I paid it willingly, thinking one day they would see me. One day they would understand that behind every success they celebrated was the silent work of my sacrifice. I remembered the years when I would rise before dawn, dress in silence so as not to wake the others, and step into the cold morning air to catch the first bus. My shoes were worn thin, my body weary, but my mind was fixed on one thing: they needed me. And if they needed me, I would not fail them. I worked in offices where my name was never remembered, where my efforts were absorbed into the triumph of others. I stood in kitchens where sweat rolled down my back, preparing meals that filled bellies but never earned thanks. I walked through every season of life carrying the weight of those around me, my own desires left behind like discarded coats in winter. There were birthdays I missed, not mine but theirs, because I was working extra hours to afford the gifts they expected. There were nights I stayed awake to finish tasks no one else bothered to complete, making sure everything ran smoothly so someone else could shine. I swallowed the bitterness of being overlooked because I thought dignity came from endurance. I thought silence was strength. But silence, while powerful, also hides wounds. And my silence hid the truth that while they lived, I was surviving. While they climbed, I was the ladder beneath their feet. While they celebrated, I was sweeping the floor after their joy had ended. And when I thought they might finally see me, finally acknowledge all I had given, all I received was dismissal. "You're in the way," they said. As if decades of sacrifice had not paved the very road they walked upon. It is easy for people to forget, the ones who build quietly. It is easy to mistake kindness for weakness, and loyalty for lack of ambition. But what they did not understand is that my sacrifice was not emptiness, it was investment. Every sleepless night, every meal I skipped, every humiliation I swallowed had been building something inside me, something they could neither see nor destroy. And so when they pushed me aside, they believed they were discarding a useless weight. But I knew the truth. I had given my life to the very thing they now claimed as theirs. My fingerprints were in every corner of that company, my effort in every brick of its foundation. The sacrifice they mocked was the same sacrifice that made me essential. Looking back, I see it clearly now. Sacrifice was not a burden. It was proof of resilience, proof of character, proof that I could survive storms that would break them in an instant. They lived cushioned lives, unaware of what it meant to give until it hurt. I lived every day on the edge of exhaustion, yet I never collapsed. That difference, though invisible at the time, was what separated us. They thought they were stronger because they shouted louder, because they walked taller. But true strength does not shout, it endures. When they said I was in the way, they revealed more about themselves than about me. They revealed their blindness, their arrogance, their inability to recognize that everything they stood upon had been carried on the back of sacrifice. And while they may have believed they won by removing me, they had only freed me from silence, freed me from invisibility, freed me to step into a role I had earned, not through entitlement, but through the kind of sacrifice that only the strongest hearts can endure. Because sacrifice is not weakness, it is the seed of power. And when it finally blooms, no one, not arrogance, not cruelty, not dismissal can stop it. So I ask you now, if your sacrifices were dismissed as nothing, would you surrender to their blindness, or would you hold on long enough to watch your silent suffering transform into undeniable strength? Humiliation leaves a scar that no one else can see but that you feel every time you breathe. It is heavier than rejection, sharper than betrayal, and colder than silence. The day they decided I was in the way became the day that scar was carved into my soul. I had endured years of being overlooked, decades of being underappreciated, but nothing could have prepared me for the brutality of being dismissed so openly, so cruelly, as though my very existence was a burden too heavy for them to carry. I still remember the room that day, the sterile brightness of the overhead lights, the polished floor that reflected everything but compassion, the sharp tone of voices that spoke about me as though I wasn't even standing there. My body was present, but in their eyes, I was already gone. They didn't look at me with love, or even with pity. They looked at me with annoyance, as though my age, my presence, my very breath had become a nuisance. "You're in the way," one of them said, not even bothering to soften the blow. "We need space, and you don't fit anymore." The words sliced through me. I had given them everything: time, loyalty, devotion, and, in a single sentence, all of it was erased. I wasn't family anymore. I wasn't part of the structure I had helped hold together. I was an inconvenience, a relic, a piece of furniture pushed into the corner to make room for something newer, shinier, more useful. I wanted to scream. I wanted to remind them of the nights I had stayed awake tending to their needs, of the sacrifices I had made so they could stand tall. I wanted to demand gratitude, to demand acknowledgement of everything I had done, but the words wouldn't come. They had already decided my worth, and nothing I said would change their blindness. So I stood there, silent, as their judgment rained down on me. The humiliation wasn't just in their words, it was in the way they laughed softly after I turned to leave, the way their eyes slid past me as though I were invisible, the way the air itself seemed to close in, suffocating me with the finality of dismissal. Humiliation is not just pain, it is the cruel reminder that those you sacrificed for believe you were never worth anything at all. As I walked out of that room, my legs felt heavy, my chest tight. Each step was a battle between despair and dignity. Outside, the world carried on, cars honking, people laughing, life continuing as though nothing had changed. But for me, everything had changed. I was no longer who I had been. I was no longer part of their story. I had been cast aside like yesterday's news, left to carry wounds no one else could see. That night, I sat alone in my small kitchen, staring at the walls that had once felt warm and familiar, but now felt like prison bars. The silence was deafening. I could still hear their voices echoing in my mind. "You're in the way." The phrase played over and over until it burrowed deep into my chest. I touched my face and realized it was wet with tears I hadn't even noticed falling. Tears of pain, yes, but also of rage. Because humiliation does more than hurt. Awakens something buried. It forces you to look at yourself, to see whether you will accept their definition of you, or rewrite your own. That night, I knew I had a choice. I could let their cruelty define me as worthless, or I could take the wound and let it harden into strength. But I wasn't ready yet. At that moment, all I could feel was the sting of being unwanted, the hollow ache of being invisible in the eyes of the very people I had once carried. Humiliation is strange in that way. Feels final, like an ending, but it is also a door, and sometimes the sharpest wounds are the ones that open the path you were always meant to walk. And so, I ask you this: if the people you gave everything to looked you in the eyes and told you that you were nothing more than a burden, would you crumble beneath their cruelty? Would you let the wound become the fire that proves them wrong? Secrets have a weight to them. Some are heavy with shame, some are light with joy, but the one I carried that day was made of steel and fire. They believed they had stripped me of everything when they told me I was in the way. They believed I walked out with nothing but my wounded pride. What they did not know, what they could never have imagined, was that folded neatly in the worn leather bag pressed against my side was the deed to the very company they worshipped. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't luck. It was the result of years of trust, years of quiet faithfulness to the man who had built it. All before they arrived to bask in the glow of his success. While they treated me like a shadow, he had seen me. While they dismissed me as insignificant, he had valued my loyalty. He had entrusted me with responsibilities they never knew about, whispered truths they never suspected, and finally, with his last breath, had given me the one thing they would never control: ownership. I still remember the day he handed me the envelope. His hands were frail, his voice weak, but his eyes burned with the sharpness of someone who saw everything clearly. "They will never understand what this company truly means," he told me, his voice cracking under the weight of both age and regret. "But you do. You've given more to this place than any of them ever will. I want you to protect it, not for them, but for what it stands for." I tried to protest. I told him I wasn't worthy, that I didn't have the power or the education to hold something so vast. But he only smiled, a tired smile that told me he had already decided. "Strength is not always loud," he said. "Sometimes it is the quiet presence that keeps everything from falling apart. And that, my dear, has always been you." When he passed, they celebrated their inheritance as though the world now belonged to them. They fought over titles, over offices, over who would sit where and hold which position of power. They ignored the quiet envelope resting in my bag, assuming it was nothing more than paperwork for a pension or retirement. They never asked, never even imagined. Why would they? In their eyes, I was nobody. Nobody holds the keys to an empire. Nobody carries the deed to a kingdom. But that is exactly who I was. Nobody to them, but everything to the truth. For months, I lived with the secret. I continued my quiet work, knowing that at any moment, if I wished, I could alter the course of everything. I watched them strut and boast, watched them mock me behind my back, watched them complain about how much I was in the way, and all the while, I knew they were standing on ground that no longer belonged to them. Every step they took, every word they spoke, every order they gave it, was all an illusion. They thought they were in control, but the foundation was already mine. When they expelled me, when their cruelty pushed me out the door, I almost laughed at the irony. They believed they had won. They believed they had erased me, silenced me, cast me aside once and for all. But as I walked away, my hand tightened on the bag at my side. Inside was not just a piece of paper, it was justice. It was the silent revenge of years of sacrifice. It was the truth that would one day unravel all their arrogance. I often wonder what their faces will look like the day they discover it. The day they realize the company they fought so hard to control, the empire they humiliated me to protect, never belonged to them at all. That the woman they dismissed as useless, invisible, in the way was the very woman who had been entrusted with everything. Humiliation is temporary. Ownership is permanent. And the moment they told me I was nothing was the same moment I knew I had everything. So let me ask you this. If you carried a secret so powerful it could rewrite the balance of power, would you reveal it in anger? Or would you wait in silence until the truth spoke louder than you ever could? Power is not always found in loud voices or in grand gestures. Sometimes it hides in the quiet moments, the ones that others overlook, the ones that seem small until you realize they were shaping the future all along. As I sat alone, after being cast aside, memories returned to me like waves crashing against the shore, memories of moments when the man who built everything had trusted me, valued me, seen me in ways no one else ever had. I remembered the early days, when the company was nothing more than a fragile dream. The offices were small, the resources scarce, and the future uncertain. Everyone else doubted him, whispered that he was wasting his time, that failure was inevitable. But I believed in him. I stayed late when others left early. I organized papers when others ignored the chaos. I listened when others mocked. And slowly, he began to notice that while others gave excuses, I gave effort. While others sought glory, I sought to make sure nothing fell apart. There were nights when he would call me into his office long after everyone else had gone home. His desk was cluttered with papers, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. "I don't know if I can keep this going," he confessed more than once, his voice cracking under the weight of fear. And each time, I reminded him of the progress he had already made, of the strength he carried inside. I would make him tea, sit quietly while he gathered his thoughts, and tell him simply, "You're not alone." Those words, spoken in the stillness of late nights, gave him the strength to keep moving forward. And in return, he gave me something more valuable than money or recognition. He gave me trust. He began handing me responsibilities no one else had: the keys to the office, access to accounts, the authority to make decisions when he was away. To others, I was invisible. To him, I was essential. And in that trust, I discovered a quiet kind of power, the kind that doesn't need to be shouted, the kind that grows slowly but deeply, like roots beneath the soil. I remembered one particular evening when the company had just landed a major contract. Everyone was celebrating, glasses raised, voices loud with pride. But behind the scenes, chaos erupted. The documents were misplaced, deadlines were at risk, and disaster loomed. I worked through the night, searching through every drawer, every file, until I found what had been lost. I stayed until dawn, organizing every detail, making sure the contract would not collapse. When he arrived that morning, his relief was visible. "You saved us," he said softly. No one else ever knew. The others celebrated the victory, but I knew the truth: the company had survived that night because of me. There were other moments, 2 moments of quiet recognition. The way his eyes softened when I entered the room. The way he leaned on me for advice he never asked of anyone else. The way he left certain tasks in my hands, knowing they would be done not just with efficiency, but with care. He once told me, "You are the backbone they don't see." At the time, I brushed it off, thinking it was only kindness. Now, I realize it was prophecy. Looking back, those flashbacks of power weren't about control or wealth. They were about respect. About being seen not for what I lacked, but for what I gave. He saw me when no one else did. He valued the sacrifices that others ignored. And in his final act of trust, he handed me the deed that proved I was not invisible. At all, he was the foundation. So when they told me I was in the way, I almost laughed at the irony. They didn't know that every brick of their empire bore my fingerprints. They didn't know that the man they idolized had chosen me, not them, to carry his legacy. They didn't know that the quiet woman they mocked had been the silent force behind their success all along. And now, as I sit with those memories, I realize something powerful. The moments they thought were small, the nights they thought I was wasting my time, the sacrifices they thought were meaningless, those were the moments that gave me strength. Those were the moments that proved I was more than they could ever comprehend. So, let me ask you, if the world dismissed you as nothing, but you knew the truth that your unseen sacrifices had built everything they now celebrate, would you stay silent, or would you let the truth one day speak louder than all their arrogance combined? Every life has a moment when silence weighs too heavily, when humiliation presses so deeply into your chest that you either collapse beneath it or stand taller because of it. For me, that moment was the day. They pushed me out completely. I had endured years of slights, months of whispers, countless moments of invisibility, but nothing could compare to the brutality of that final dismissal. It was not just an insult, it was the breaking point where my patience met their cruelty head-on. The room was colder than usual that day. Perhaps it was the air conditioning, perhaps it was the ice in their voices, but either way I felt it in my bones. They called me in with little ceremony, their eyes already set in judgment. I stood there, hands clasped in front of me, waiting for words that would cut deeper than any blade. And then they came. "You're holding us back. You're in the way. It's time for you to step aside." There was no gratitude for decades of work, no acknowledgement of the sacrifices that had built their comfort, no kindness, no hesitation, only the cold arrogance of people who believed they had outgrown the very person who had sustained them. Their words echoed against the sterile walls and pierced straight into my heart. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, a rush of shame and disbelief colliding inside me. I had expected disrespect, but never such open cruelty. I looked around the room, searching for even one sympathetic face. None. Their eyes slid past me as if I were a ghost, a shadow cluttering their perfect image. My throat tightened, words struggling to break free, but I forced myself to stay silent. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me beg. I would not let them reduce me further by answering cruelty with desperation. So I stood there, still, quiet, my dignity holding me upright even as my heart crumbled. When they gestured toward the door, I picked up the worn leather bag that never left my side. My steps were slow, deliberate, carrying me across the room with a calmness that betrayed the storm inside me. Behind me, I heard their laughter, low, smug, filled with the confidence of people who believed they had won. Each chuckle was another dagger, another reminder that they saw me as disposable, replaceable, worthless. As I stepped out into the hallway, the silence roared louder than their insults. The world outside seemed unchanged, phones ringing, papers shuffling, people moving about their day, but for me, everything had shifted. My chest ached with the weight of humiliation, yet beneath that pain, something stirred, a spark, faint but undeniable, lit within me. They had dismissed me as weak, invisible, nothing. But in that very moment, I realized that silence could also be strength, that walking away without a word could be the loudest response of all. I remember reaching the front doors, pausing for a brief second. The sunlight streamed through the glass, spilling onto the floor like a promise. I tightened my grip on the bag at my side. Inside lay the secret that would one day unravel all their arrogance, but at that moment, I did not reveal it. I walked through those doors quietly, carrying not only their rejection, but also my dignity intact. Outside, the air was crisp, sharp against my face. I breathed deeply, letting the sting of humiliation settle into my lungs. For a brief moment, tears threatened to fall, but I blinked them away. Crying would not undo what had been done. Instead, I let the pain harden into resolve. Their cruelty had not destroyed MIT, had freed me from the burden of loyalty to those who never valued me, freed me from the chains of invisibility, freed me to finally step into the power I had always carried but never revealed. That day became my breaking point. Not because it ended me, but because it transformed me. They thought they had silenced me, but in truth, they had given me a voice stronger than ever before. They thought they had erased me, but in truth, they had written the beginning of a story they would never control. And so, I ask you this: when the world humiliates you in front of everyone, when people strip you of dignity and laugh as you walk away, would you crumble beneath their cruelty? Or would you turn that breaking point into the moment you rise higher than they ever believed possible? Fate has a way of circling back. It may take time, it may demand patience, but eventually, it returns to balance what was broken. After the day they pushed me out, I kept walking quietly, my head low but my spirit alive. They thought my silence meant defeat, But silence was simply the space where destiny was sharpening its edge. And destiny, as it turned out, had chosen me long before they ever dismissed me. Days passed, then weeks. I lived quietly, watching from the shadows while they celebrated what they believed was their victory. They strutted through the company halls, wore smug smiles, and carried themselves as if the world belonged to them. To anyone looking in, it seemed they had triumphed. But inside my leather bag, hidden away with the same care I once gave to them, was the truth that would undo everything. The deed, the document, signed and sealed, placing ownership not in their hands, but in mine. The moment of revelation came sooner than I expected. A crisis hit. Contracts were questioned, legal documents reviewed, and for the first time in years, they faced a challenge they couldn't bluff their way through. They gathered in the office, shouting, blaming one another, scrambling for answers, and then, like a storm breaking open the sky, the truth emerged. A lawyer, flipping through the records, stopped cold. His eyes widened, his voice dropped. "This company doesn't belong to you," he said flatly. "According to these papers, ownership is in her name, my name." For a moment, the room fell into stunned silence. Their laughter evaporated, their arrogance dissolved. I wasn't there to see their faces, but I can imagine the shock, the way their eyes must have darted around, desperate for explanation, the way their mouths opened but no words came. The same people who once told me I was in the way suddenly realized the floor beneath them didn't belong to them at all. Every decision they made, every order they gave, every title they claimed, it was all an illusion. The empire they believed was theirs had never been theirs at all. It was mine. When the news finally reached me, I sat quietly, the letter trembling in my hands. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I simply let the truth settle deep into me like a long-awaited sunrise. They had humiliated me, erased me, cast me aside. But humiliation cannot erase truth. Their cruelty could not cancel the trust that had been placed in me. Ownership does not bow to arrogance, it stands firm, waiting for the moment when the world must acknowledge it. In the days that followed, the calls began. Their voices, once sharp with mockery, now dripped with desperation. "We didn't know," they pleaded. "We didn't mean it that way. Can we talk? Can we work this out?" But I remembered their laughter when I walked out, the way they had looked at me as if I were invisible. I remembered every sting of humiliation, every wound they had inflicted. And though part of me longed to answer with anger, I chose something far more powerful: silence. The turn of fate wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about screaming in their faces or throwing their cruelty back at them. It was about dignity. It was about showing them that true power doesn't need to shout. True power is patient. It waits quietly until the day the truth reveals itself. And on that day, the truth is louder than any insult, sharper than any humiliation. They thought they had ended me. In reality, they had handed me the stage, and the very thing they used to push me down became the platform from which I rose higher than they could ever reach. That is the irony of fate. It uses the hands of your enemies to lift you into the place you were always meant to stand. So I ask you now, if fate turned in your favor, if the very people who humiliated you were forced to face your true power, would you forgive them, or would you let silence remind them of everything they once dismissed? Beginnings rarely arrive the way we imagine them. We think of them as fresh, clean slates, untouched by pain or betrayal. But the truth is, new beginnings are often born from ashes, from the wreckage of what others tried to destroy in us. My new beginning did not come wrapped in joy or celebration. It came quietly, through the pain of humiliation and the weight of silence, when the truth finally placed me where I had always belonged. The day I stepped back into the company, everything felt different. The walls were the same, the desks still lined with papers, the air filled with the same faint hum of machines, but the atmosphere had shifted. Where once I had walked those halls as someone invisible, overlooked and unwanted, now I walked with the knowledge that every corner, every light, every brick belonged to me. The whispers that once cut me down were replaced with nervous silence. Eyes that once rolled in disdain now darted away in shame. Powell has a strange way of changing the way people see you. But what mattered most was not their gaze, it was mine. I had always seen myself as someone small, someone who belonged in the background, someone who supported but never led. But now, as I walked through those doors, I realized that I had been leading all along. Quiet leadership, the kind that holds everything together while others take credit, is still leadership. And in that moment, I embraced it fully. I was no longer the invisible woman they had mocked. I was the owner, the decision maker, the one with the authority to shape what came next. Taking the reins was not about vengeance, it was about dignity. I did not raise my voice, did not hurl back the insults they once threw at me. I did not need to. My presence was enough. My silence was enough. They felt the weight of their own cruelty simply by seeing me stand where they believed I would never stand. But a new beginning is not just about proving others wrong, it is about proving yourself right. I had carried the weight of sacrifice for decades, pouring myself into others until there was little left for me. This time, it was different. This time, my energy, my decisions, my life were no longer tied to their approval. I no longer needed their acknowledgement to know my worth. I no longer sought their gratitude to validate my sacrifices. My worth was written into the very foundation of the building, sealed in the deed they had never seen coming. I began making changes, not out of spite, but out of vision. The company, once riddled with arrogance and entitlement, needed renewal. I hired people who understood humility, who valued effort over titles. I promoted voices that had been silenced, gave chances to those overlooked, and built an environment where respect was not optional but required. Slowly, the culture shifted. What had once been a place of arrogance became a place of accountability. And in this transformation, I discovered something even more powerful: freedom. Freedom from their cruelty. Freedom from their blindness. Freedom from the need to prove myself over and over again. I no longer had to ask for a seat at the table. I owned the table. I no longer had to beg for recognition. I had built my own stage. The new beginning wasn't just about business. It was about identity. For the first time in my life, I stood firmly in who I was, without apology, without hesitation. I was not too old, not in the way, not disposable. I was the living proof that dignity cannot be destroyed, that sacrifice is never wasted, and that patience eventually turns into power. And yet, even in this triumph, I carried a quiet question in my heart. What should I do with those who had once mocked me? Should I let them remain humbled and small beneath the shadow of their own arrogance? Or should I send them away, as they had once done to me? Power gives you choices, and those choices reveal who you truly are. My new beginning was not about revenge. It was about finally being free to choose, free to decide the path forward without the weight of their judgment, free to stand tall, not because they finally saw me, but because I finally saw myself. So let me ask you this: if life handed you the power to rebuild from the ashes of humiliation, would you use it to destroy those who hurt you, to create something so strong, so unshakable, that their cruelty no longer mattered? The phone rang days later. The same people who had looked me in the eyes and told me I was in the way now called me with trembling voices, words heavy with hesitation. "We didn't mean it like that," they whispered. "We were under pressure. We didn't realize how much you meant to everything." Their excuses dripped with desperation. Their voices laced with the same fear that once dripped from mine when I stood before them, waiting to be cast aside. I held the receiver in silence, listening to every word, every attempt to rewrite the past. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let their voices wash over me. And I remembered the cold sting of that day when they laughed as I walked out. I remembered the humiliation, the shame, the loneliness of sitting in my kitchen with only silence as my companion. I remembered the weight of being told I was nothing. And now, those same voices were begging for a place in the future I owned. "Please," one of them said, "we can make this right. Just give us another chance. Another chance." The words rolled around in my mind like a stone, rough and sharp. They had stripped me of dignity, torn away my worth with cruel words, and left me to carry wounds alone. And now they wanted another chance. I looked around the room where I sat, papers scattered across the desk, plans for the future neatly stacked in front of me, my name signed at the bottom of every document of ownership. This was not the life they had imagined for me. This was not the life they had chosen. This was the life I had been given through loyalty, through sacrifice, through patience. And now I had the choice. The irony was almost too much to bear. They once told me I was in the way, and now they were desperate to be in mine. They once laughed as I left quietly, and now they were begging for my silence to be broken with words of forgiveness. They once believed I was powerless, and now they knew the truth that power had been mine all along. But what is power without wisdom? What is victory if it turns into vengeance? I knew that in this moment, my decision would define not only my future but the legacy of everything I had endured. If I forgave them, it would not erase the cruelty of the past. If I cast them aside, it would not erase the pain. Either way, the wound would remain, but it was up to me to decide what that wound would become: scar that reminded me of resilience, or an open sore that bled bitterness. Sometimes, being ignored is the greatest blessing. Because when the world ignores you, you learn to see yourself. You learn that your value does not depend on their applause or their approval. You learn that dignity is not given, it is claimed. And in being ignored, I found my worth. In being dismissed, I found my strength. In walking away silently, I discovered that silence itself can become the loudest voice of all. The phone continued to buzz, their voices rising in desperation. But I did not answer with anger. I did not answer at all. My silence was enough. They would never know if forgiveness lived in my heart or if I had closed the door forever. They would never know if I planned to welcome them back or let them taste the very isolation they once forced upon me. That uncertainty became its own kind of justice. Because sometimes the most powerful response is not to show your hand. Sometimes the greatest strength is to leave the ending unwritten, to let the future hang in silence, forcing those who hurt you to sit with the weight of their own actions. And so here I stand, not broken, not erased, but transformed. They told me I was in the way. They told me I was nothing. But in truth, I was the foundation, the owner, the one who walked away quietly with everything they thought belonged to them. Now I leave you with this question: if those who humiliated you, who stripped you of dignity, came crawling back when the tables turned, would you forgive them more? Would you let silence remind them forever of the day they chose to ignore your worth? Life has a way of testing us in ways we never imagine. There are moments when the people we give everything to turn their backs on us. Moments when our sacrifices are treated as nothing. Moments when humiliation cuts deeper than any wound. And yet, it is in those very moments of rejection that faith is born. Not the kind of faith that waits for others to recognize us, but the faith that whispers quietly within, "You are more than their blindness. You are stronger than their cruelty. You are destined for something greater than their approval." When they told me I was in the way, they believed they were ending my story. But God does not let cruelty write the final chapter. What they meant for harm became the very spark that awakened the truth inside me. My journey was not about revenge or bitterness. It was about discovering that strength does not come from titles or applause. Strength comes from knowing that even when others dismiss you, your worth remains untouched. It comes from standing in faith when the world tells you to fall. I have learned that silence can be sacred. When they humiliated me, I did not fight back with anger. I walked away quietly, carrying not defeat but dignity. And in that silence, I found clarity. I found the courage to see myself not as a victim of their cruelty, but as a survivor, a builder, a keeper of truths they could never take away. And it was in that silence that God's timing revealed itself, because sometimes the doors that close on us are the very doors that lead us to the life we were always meant to live. Every tear, every sleepless night, every sacrifice I made without thanks was not wasted. They were seeds, seeds planted in the soil of suffering, watered by patience, and nourished by faith. And when the time was right, those seeds bloomed into something powerful: ownership, dignity, freedom. The same people who once mocked me were forced to witness that transformation, and I did not need to raise my voice for them to hear it. My existence, my survival, my resilience became the loudest sermon of all. Faith is not about escaping pain. It is about enduring it with the knowledge that pain does not define you. Faith is not about avoiding humiliation. It is about refusing to let humiliation erase your value. Faith is the quiet confidence that the world can strip everything away, but it cannot strip away who you are in the eyes of God. And in His eyes, you are never in the way. You are never too small, never too late, never too invisible. You are chosen. You are seen. You are enough. This is the truth I want you to carry with you. What others use to push you down can become the very foundation that lifts you higher. The cruelty of others does not cancel the promise over your life. Their blindness does not diminish your light. And when you are left standing alone, remember this: you are never truly alone. For every step you take in faith, every quiet decision to hold your dignity, you are walking with a strength that no humiliation can erase. And so I leave you with this: never let the voices of those who reject you drown out the truth of who you are. Never let their blindness convince you that you are unseen. Hold on to faith, hold on to dignity, hold on to the quiet power that comes from knowing your worth. Because the tables always turn, the truth always rises, and your story is not finished until victory has spoken. If this story touched you, if you believe that resilience and faith can turn even the cruelest rejection into a testimony of strength, then I invite you to show your support. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me on this journey. Because the next story will remind you once again that even in the darkest moments, light is waiting to break through. Do not miss it. The next chapter may be the one that speaks directly to your heart.